Hey, everybody. Joining me this week is author Dan Charnas. You know him from the Big Payback, you hip hop fans out there to listen to the show. He has a new book called Dilla Time. And if you're a hip hop person like me, you know at some point in your life, you have wanted to try to, at the very least, climb the mountain that is the J Dilla world, whatever. And this man has taken it on and has conquered it. My man, Dan Charnas. Dan, how are you, sir?
Man, I'm great. It's an honor to be here, sir.
I love this book so much, and it's something that's so important to me that I've always wanted to know more about and learn about. How did you take this on? How did this start for you? Walk me through it.
Oh, where to even begin? I think it started when I made my first trip to Detroit as a record executive and producer with the producer who was then known as JD. I had signed an artist to Rick Rubin's label, American Recordings. We were making Chino XL's second album, and Chino and I had a budget to work with the best. And we both decided we wanted to work with this kid, JD, who had only been around for about 4 years, but had done great stuff with The Far Side and Tribe Called Quest. And we had just heard this sort of bootlegged Slum Village album. So we really wanted to do it, and to do it right, we wanted to go to Detroit because we heard that's the way you do it. Drove out to his basement in Cardin's, down to the basement. There's Common Sense. I was still calling him Common Sense at the time. What's Common Sense doing here? Yeah, I had no idea he was aching like water for chocolate with JD at that moment.
Wow.
This is in the summer of '99. So we spent a few days there, very uneventful, and frankly, not something that I was trying to document as a journalist either, because it had been about 7 years since I had written for the Source magazine.
Okay.
And I was there in my capacity as record executive. I left my camera at the damn hotel. I didn't realize the level of history that was happening in that basement at that time.
When did J Dilla become on your radar?
Well, the first moment of recognition was back in '95 when I first heard Runnin'. I was told that there was this new producer for The Far Side after their original producer, Jay Swift, had left. How could anybody replace Jay Swift? We thought.
Yeah, right.
And of course, Runnin' made that argument immediately. But it wasn't until I came back from Detroit and we started mixing the Chino XL album that I had my rhythmic epiphany. I was listening to a song called Don't Say a Word over and over and over again, because that's what you do when you mix a record. And I was listening to the drums and I said, what's wrong with those hi-hats? Are they swinging? They sound off. I was so intrigued by this that I literally went back to my studio, sampled the piece of music, put it up in my digital audio workstation, lined up the waveform with the time grid, and realized the hats were actually right on time. The snare drum was coming in early. Why is he doing that? How is he doing that?
Right.
Why does it sound so good? And it was right around that moment, this is the year 2000, that other producers start incorporating those rhythmic signatures into their work. So that was the moment that I realized, what JD is doing is actually beginning to realize that it was having an impact on traditional musicians as well.
And you're reading a book that is actually can make you a believer in very simple terms. Talk to me about how important that was for you, for it not to be an elite language, but an every person language.
That's a great question. I am a professor. I teach young people about the importance of music and musical figures. So I'm in a habit to make simple but strong arguments about musical figures. And when I started teaching my music history course at NYU back in 2014, J Dilla was somebody I taught in the last class. Not only because my students knew him, but they were also influenced in many ways using some of his rhythmic innovations. J Dilla invented a new rhythm time feel in music. In other words, a way of feeling time for musicians and programmers. What does that mean?
Yeah.
Well, popular music has had generally two time feels, what we'll call straight and swung. And what does straight and swung mean? Essentially, it's even beats versus uneven beats. Straight is this: 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. You know what that sounds like. That makes sense. That's even. Swing is 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. A different feel. It's uneven. And now that swung feel evolves out of the American context, right? It's not European in derivation. It comes from the presence of Africans and their descendants on this continent. In some ways, it is a context, right?
Right.
So these are the two time feels that we've been playing with. And I often play my students Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody as a way to illustrate the difference between the two. Again, we're just looking for simple ways to talk about this stuff. And that didn't change in American music until around 1998, in a basement in Detroit on a drum machine, found a way to collide straight rhythms and swung rhythms simultaneously, putting them in degrees of conflict with each other that created a kind of rhythmic friction that feels like it's limping. We use these words, right? Limping, loping, drunken, sloppy, but it's not sloppy. It's intentional. And what's essentially happening is when you're pitting straight rhythms against swung rhythms, it's like being in a car going 55 miles per hour. And then somebody comes along and says, no, go 70 miles per hour. And then somebody else comes along and says, no, go 55. So you feel like you're speeding up and slowing down, but you're still maintaining this tempo. That's that elastic, I guess is what I'm looking for, the elastic feeling of a JD beat. And that is the time feel. Not only is it the first time feel to completely arise on a machine, but it's also the first time feel to jump from the machine to man. That's when Questlove and D'Angelo said, okay, he's doing this on a machine. Can we do this with our traditional instruments, with drums and bass and keys? And that was what gave us Voodoo. And of course, you know, Voodoo by D'Angelo in the year 2000 had an enormous effect, especially in jazz.
Oh, yeah.
Jazz musicians started incorporating that time feel. So Dilla Time is something like straight, like swung, that is felt in all genres of music. When I came back from Detroit, it took me a while to even realize what was going on in the demos and tracks that I had been listening to for 3/4 of the year.
Right.
And I think the next step for me is when I finally started writing again for magazines in around 2005. I moved back to New York. I was in graduate school for journalism at Columbia. I pitched an idea about JD's influence on this new generation of programmers. And that is when I found out that he was sick, because I went for an interview with him, or went to request an interview, and his manager, one-time manager, Tim Maynor, said, I don't know, man. I mean, he's in and out of the hospital. And so I never did write that article. And in less than a year, he was gone. It was around that time that I started working on the Big Payback. And that is when JD beats just became part of my everyday life, because I write to instrumentals, whether it's jazz or house and so that another layer of recognizing his genius as I just listened to these beat tapes over and over and over again. And then I became a teacher, and that another step, right? Which I started in 2017. And the idea was, okay, since I'm connected in Detroit, I'm going to take all the students, all 20 students, on a field trip for 3 days to Detroit. We did that for 3 days on spring break 2017. And then we came back to New York after that trip for 7 weeks, and I taught the class. And we were joined in Detroit by, Fat Cat and RJ and Young RJ and Uncle Herm, who had the donut shop. And we did tours of the Motown Museum with Dennis Coffey, who was the original funk brother. And we went to Submerge, which was the techno museum. So we got a real Detroit and Detroit music education. Then we came back to New York, and we met with Questlove and Bob Power, and we talked to Trey from The Far Side and Perrin Moss from Hiatus Coyote, and created a full experience around what J Dilla had done to music. And it was in the course of teaching that class that I realized that there was very little for people to read about J Dilla that was musically accurate. And that is where the anger comes in, my friend.
Yes.
Because I had become very angry at hearing even people who should know better, even people who make beats and use an MPC drum machine, saying stuff like, well, Dilla, you know, that unquantized feel, like all he did was not quantize, and that's J Dilla. That made me so angry, because as a beat maker, who the MPC was not a primary instrument for me at all, but even I knew what the machine did, and I knew that that wasn't J Dilla's only technique, and I also knew that that wasn't the real point, that he had done something far beyond his techniques. What did his techniques do musicologically, music theory wise? That's what I was interested in. That's was the impetus for writing what I thought was going to be a very thin book about the musical science of JD. And the problem with me is once I start reporting, I can't stop. And so 5 interviews became 10, became 50, became 100, became 200. And that's how we ended up with a 400-page book on J Dilla.
I wanted to know, what is your relationship with the MPC?
Well, you know, my setup was actually this more of James Yancy's original setup, which was the SB 1200. That was the machine that he used to make his first hits. Runnin' and Stakes is High. I think even Sometimes by the Brand New Heavies was all done on an SB 1200 with an outboard sampler for more sampling time. Right. And for me, it was a combination of the SB 1200 and an ASR 10 back when I was producing professionally in the 1990s. Later on, of course, it went, like a lot of folks, to digital audio workstations.
In the back here, I want everybody to see this just for a second here. Of course, we have your, you know, this is not the Technics 1200. This is a more of an affordable, but this is the Audio Technicas 140 XP, which is a tank of a machine, and it does almost everything the Technics does. But over here, as you can see, we have, make it a little closer here. This is the MPC. This is the Renaissance. This is the MPC Renaissance. What's pretty cool about, I'll turn it on just for a second here, just so you can see it. What's pretty cool about this machine here, if you can see it or not, is it in the right-hand corner here, there's a thing called vintage mode, where if you hit vintage mode, you actually can go back to have the sounds of MPC 3000, which was JD's instrument. And of course, in the original one, the MPC 60 right here. So
interesting.
So that's why they call it the Renaissance, because it's got it all.
And James was a master at both machines, but he discovered in the late 1990s that the MPC had a little bit more functionality than the SP anyway. It had more sampling time. You could sample in stereo. It had a much more elaborate sequencer, but it did else too. When you use the swing function on an SP, which was a way to make the beats uneven in various degrees rather than even, as we said before, when you would swing it on an SP, everything swung. If you had a kick drum, a snare, a hi-hat, everything would be uneven. But the MPC allowed the programmer to severably affect or not affect sounds with swing. So you could quantize some elements and not quantize, meaning auto-correct. To put them, align them perfectly to you could swing some elements and not swing some elements. And then there was this other function called shift timing.
Right.
And it's, of course, it's very familiar to us on computers now. You just point and click and drag something back. Yeah. But this is the 90s.
Yeah.
To allow you to move segments and sounds backwards or forwards in time by little incremental amounts, ticks, essentially. And these are the tools that James Yancy used, or misused, if you prefer, to give his production a rhythmic feel that was almost alien. Now, he was playing with time before this,
Right.
And he had other techniques. He did play his elements freehand without quantization. He did. He also did something I call deceleration, and we don't talk about that enough. That what James would do is he would take a sample of something,
Right.
somebody playing guitar, and he would slow it way down. And when you slow a sample of a human being playing an instrument down, what happens is you elongate whatever mistakes they make. And he loved that sound. And you can hear it in the decelerated samples of songs like Fall in Love, Conant Gardens, Players. These are all the She Said remix of Far Side.
Portishead fans will recognize that there's a great sample that they use from the song She Said.
I'm going to show you how to do the scratch from Portishead's Only You using the Far Side She Said and Ken Throne in the Alleyways from the Inspector Clouseau film.
You play. And then we go over here.
Never realized that's where it came from. See, now you and I are in sync because that was number 2. One of the things that I have to say about JD, especially with regard to doing interviews about this, is that Dilla invented Dilla Time, but not everything that Dilla did was Dilla Time.
That's
right?
it. That's it.
So the first phase of his will go from, say, 94 to 98, was basically using only 2 techniques, which was playing, not using the timing correct functions of the drum machines, and deceleration. These were ways that he played with time to allow the sound of error into the mix, even though his placement of things was not erratic.
Yeah.
Starting in 98 begins this next phase, which is the Dilla Time phase, which is the rushed snare, which is the exaggerated, and you can hear it at its peak with Welcome to Detroit in 2001. Then he moves into, I guess, what you might call a more low fidelity phase that begins with an EP called Rough Draft in 2003 that he produced in 2002. It also includes the work that he does for J-Lib, Champions. And that freeness will also inform what he eventually does in 2004 with the Dill Withers mixed beat tape. Some people call it the Motown tape, and then Donuts and The Shining. But throughout this, there are other little movements, right? He gives up sampling for a while in 2001, 2002, because he doesn't want to pay. You know, he's now a business owner. He doesn't want to pay.
Yeah.
And it does not go well for him. I personally don't really favor that stuff, not because he didn't have skill and couldn't have done it. He just had been spending most of his life developing his voice as a master of the sampled art form. And he had not yet mastered creating music without samples in that way. So it's less evocative for me, but all it would have taken him, I believe, is time.
But time was unfortunately something that he did not have a lot of. When did it become informed by his illness?
He was very much a person who was in the present all the time, the eternal present. And that eternal present allowed him to stay focused, allowed him to create a prodigious body of work in very little time. He worked on beats very quickly, 15 minutes and done. You know, it was very, very, had singular dedication. And that has all kinds of consequences. He was a stutterer as a kid, and he was very silent. And he cultivated silence and cultivated listening as a way of surviving, because to speak stutterer can be somewhat socially risky.
Yeah, right, sure.
But he also had this talent, so people were sort of drawn to him. But there were also ways in which James was underdeveloped socially because he had been sort of spoiled by his parents. Story about Erykah Badu coming to Detroit, and he plays her a bunch of beats, and she's like, nah, I don't want any of those. I want to make something together. And he feels some kind of way about that. Like, who is this person telling me? Who is this famous person coming to Detroit to my basement telling me to make a no, you make it. That was essentially what it was. No, you make it. And Erykah, of course, experienced this sort of magnanimous, always teaching me how to make beats.
Right.
But there was another dimension to that.
For sure.
But as a result, it grew him up a little bit. I wish I could tell you that my observations of him in that trip were profound. They weren't, because I was doing something that I regret now, which is I was talking. I was entertaining him. I was telling stories. I was just jabbering away. And he was doing his job, which is listening.
Right.
That's what he does. He's a bionic listener. And what I experienced was his world that he wanted us to be in. We didn't negotiate where we were going to eat dinner. We went to where he wanted to go. Everybody was on James' time. Everybody was doing what James wanted to do.
Yeah.
And if James didn't want to do it, we weren't doing it. And Common, of course, tells the best story about this. I had a new recording contract for MCA, and Jay has him just waiting at the hotel most of the time for him to come pick him up. And sometimes Jay doesn't come at all. He doesn't trip. He's like, I just want the best out of this guy. And I know he's a genius, and I know he's going to give it to me. I just have to be patient. I just have to wait. James Yancey's advice to people around him was just listen, just watch. Common learned it too. Just wait.